John Harkness valued honor, duty, and integrity. Growing up in a small town, he learned the importance of hard work while helping his father at the family auto repair shop. His father, a Korean War veteran, instilled in him a deep respect for service, which John carried throughout his life. After high school, John joined the Marines, quickly earning a reputation for toughness and leadership. John's life changed when he met Julie, a paralegal. They fell in love, married, and built a life based on love and trust. But when the Vietnam War started, John felt compelled to serve, despite being in the reserves. He volunteered for deployment, putting their plans to start a family on hold. Though Julie was supportive, it weighed heavily on both of them. Years later, John reflected on their 50-year journey together while getting a tattoo in her honor, only the second one of his life. As both a mechanic and a Marine, John excelled. He believed reservists like him should help carry the burden of the Vietnam War, even though they weren't being called up due to the high number of draftees. In March 1967, after 3 years of marriage and buying a house, he discussed his decision to volunteer with Julie, who worked at a local law firm. While it was tough, they were financially stable, and John assured her they'd be fine. Julie, though tearful, understood John's strong sense of duty. At 6'6", John was tough, but marriage had softened his rougher edges. The night before he left, they shared an emotional goodbye. "Come back to me safe and sound," Julie said, "and remember, you're mine." John laughed. "Don't worry, honey. I'll take care of myself. Just behave while I'm gone." With a smile, she replied, "I promise to be good." Before leaving for Vietnam, John updated his will and arranged for part of his $240.60 monthly salary as an E-4 to go toward their mortgage. Half of his pay covered the house, and a quarter went into their joint account for utilities. John figured he wouldn't need much and hoped hazard pay would cover any extra expenses. He did, however, get one indulgence before leaving, a tattoo of a knife with the words, "Death before dishonor." He considered getting a rose with a name, but remembered his father's advice and decided against it. In Vietnam, John was assigned as a fire team commander in a Marine battalion. Although the regular Marines were initially skeptical of him as a reservist, he quickly earned their respect in battle. Unlike some soldiers, John avoided the local women, not only because he was happily married, but also due to fear of diseases. "Come on, man, it's Vietnam," Harker, a fellow corporal, teased him. John showed him a picture of Julie. "Not with her waiting for me," he replied. Harker laughed. "Beautiful, but you know Jody's already with her," referring to the slang for men who seduced military wives. John shook his head. "Not Julie, she'd never do that." As the weeks passed, John wrote to Julie often and cherished her letters, reading them over and over. Her letters, which had initially come every 2 weeks, became less frequent. John didn't worry at first, thinking the delays were due to their unit's movements, but it seemed strange that he heard from his parents more often than from her. One day, John received photos of Julie in a swimsuit, but he didn't recognize the swimsuit or know who took the pictures. He brushed it off, focusing on the war and his duties. When Christmas passed with no word from Julie, John grew worried but pushed the thoughts aside. By January 1968, his unit was near Da Nang, where rumors of a major enemy offensive for Tet circulated. At the end of the month, the enemy attacked early in the morning and John's position was overrun. Most of his team, including Harker, were eliminated, and John was seriously wounded. He was evacuated to a naval hospital in Da Nang, then transferred to San Francisco. Doctors saved his leg, and though the bullet missed his vital organs, he faced a long recovery. His ear was permanently damaged, and a scar would remain on his cheek. A Marine officer awarded him a Purple Heart and informed him he was recommended for the Silver Star, adding to his other honors. Sadly, the only surviving member of his crew, Jennings, died from his wounds. John's parents met him in San Francisco, but Julie wasn't there. When John asked about her, his father, after some hesitation, revealed that they hadn't seen her in weeks. His father shared that he had last seen Julie about 2.5 months earlier when he spotted a man leaving John's house in a sports car while Julie waved from the doorway in a robe. Since then, she hadn't returned calls or been home. His father apologized, saying he had been collecting the mail and newspapers in her absence. John was devastated. He had been sure of Julie's faithfulness, but now Harker's warnings about Jody made sense. He finally understood why she had gone silent. "Was it a blue Corvette?" John asked. Bob nodded. "Yes, why?" "It belongs to Eric Swagman, a junior partner at her firm," John replied. "So she's not even home to get the mail?" "Doesn't seem like it," Bob said. "I noticed final notices for utilities in the phone, so I paid them." I figured you wouldn't want to come home to no power phone. Thanks, Dad, John said. I'll pay you back when I can. Don't worry about it. Focus on getting better. I can issue a power of attorney if you want. If she hasn't been paying bills, who knows what else she's done. Maybe even emptied your accounts. John called over a nurse to arrange a meeting with a military lawyer. A naval lieutenant commander soon arrived, took notes, and prepared the necessary documents. I'll handle the paperwork for you, Corporal, the officer said. Your parents will get power of attorney. I recommend contacting a family lawyer as soon as possible. We'll meet this afternoon to sign everything. Thank you, sir, John said. After the lawyer left, Bob reassured John. Once we're home, I'll check the bank and stop by the house. I still have the key you gave me. If you want, I can ask George Williams. He's retired and now does private investigations. He owes me a few favors. I don't know if I can afford a private investigator, Dad. Don't worry about that. George and I go way back. I can also talk to our family lawyer. Oh, by the way, Wilkins said your spot is still open at the workshop. He's been saving part of your salary as a bonus for your return. Just don't tell him I told you. John appreciated Wilkins' gesture. Though rarely showing his softer side, Wilkins was kind and generous beneath his gruff exterior, always honest and fair with customers. That sounds good, Dad, John said, wiping a tear. He silently cursed Julie. His parents hugged him. Everything will be fine, son, his mother reassured him. We'll handle it. A couple of hours later, the lawyer returned with a notary. After the documents were signed, John's parents left, promising to call with any updates. They thanked the nurse, who assured them John was in good hands and would soon be discharged to a VA hospital for physical therapy. Left alone, John finally slept. But his dreams weren't of Julie. He saw the Marines from his fire team, disfigured but sitting around a fire, talking as they used to. I'm sorry I couldn't bring you with me, John said. Harker smiled, lighting a cigarette. It's okay, Corporal. You did your best. Besides, there's no Charlie where we are now. Jennings nodded. Parker's right. I'm just surprised any of us made it out of there. Yeah, Johansson chimed in. It was only 10,000 of them against the 4 of us, right? Trujillo laughed. I think we took down about 9,000 of them. The others laughed, but Harker grew serious. You've got another battle ahead, brother. We all know it. And about Jody. Yeah, I was kidding back then. But you need to deal with him. The others grunted in agreement. We may not be with you in person, but we're with you in spirit, Johansson added. Thanks, guys, John said. See you, Harker replied with a smile. John woke up in a sweat. The dream felt so real, especially Harker's words. He knew someone would pay, but he needed more information first. A few days later, John got a call from his father. There's bad news, John, Bob said. Julie drained both your checking and savings accounts, leaving just $5. She also withdrew $8,545 from her own account 2 months ago, all in cash. The only money that came in was your military pay, which she withdrew after each payday. Okay, Dad, John replied. You have power of attorney. Take her name off the account. We don't have credit cards, so that's one less thing to worry about. I'll handle it. I also checked the house. It's a mess. Food is rotting, dishes are piled up, and it smells awful. She took everything except her wedding dress, our album, and her rings, which I found thrown in the bathroom trash. At least the house is still standing, John said. Yes, but the bed's filthy. I bet she brought her lover here. What do you want to do? Get rid of it, John said. Break it down and toss it. I'll sleep on a cot if I have to. Will do, Bob agreed. By the way, George offered to help for free. He said nothing's worse than stealing a soldier's wife while he's at war. I also found a lawyer who will handle your divorce at no charge. He can't stand swagman. George suggests we change the locks, and I agree. Yeah, go ahead with that, John said. How are you holding up? Bob asked. I'm fine, really, John replied. Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself? Bob asked, knowing his son well. Dad, you lost people in battle, right? Of course. John realized it was a foolish question. His father, a second lieutenant in the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Chesty Puller, had fought in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in 1950. He knew all about combat, loss, and pass away. Yes, son, I did, Bob replied. Have you ever had dreams where they talk to you? John asked. Yeah, almost every night at first. They fade over time, Bob said. Did you ever get over it? You never fully get over it. It becomes part of you. You learn to live with it or it will consume you, Bob answered. The next 2 weeks passed quickly for John. His parents called almost daily with updates on Julie. She had moved in with Eric Swagman and was pregnant by him. Their relationship was an open secret at work. John's lawyer, Mike McGregor, filed for divorce on grounds of infidelity and abandonment, along with a domestic violence suit against Eric. Mike also pursued legal action against Julie's employer for violating their moral code and considered filing complaints with the state bar based on evidence George had gathered. Julie was furious when she found out she no longer had access to John's military paycheck account. She called John's parents in a rage, but they told her to ask Eric for money. She was also upset when her house keys didn't work, but they reminded her she no longer lived there. John found this amusing and focused on his physical and psychological therapy. Physically, John's wounds were healing, and he was learning to walk with a cane and crutch. Psychologically, he struggled with both the loss of his Marines and the betrayal by his wife. When his cast was removed, he asked the doctor about driving, and the doctor said he could, as long as it was an automatic. As John was wheeled back to his room, he noticed an orderly hanging up his uniform, now with sergeant's stripes. The doctor entered and explained, "You've been promoted, Sergeant, and you're discharged. You'll continue physical therapy at a VA near home, but don't put too much strain on your leg for now. Let's get you into your uniform, and we'll head to the break room." John found his freshly laundered uniform with corporal stripes still on it. After getting dressed, the nurse helped him with his boots, polished to a shine. Using a cane, John was led to his wheelchair and taken to the break room. To his surprise, his parents, doctors, nurses, and Lieutenant Colonel Arvin Johnson, his reserve battalion commander, were waiting. The colonel motioned for John to come forward. John surprised everyone by standing with his cane, and Lieutenant Colonel Johnson smiled, shaking his hand. He then read a promotion order, officially appointing John as a sergeant in the Marine Corps Reserves, adding, "And may God have mercy on your soul," which drew laughter. John's parents proudly removed his old stripes and attached the new ones. Then Lieutenant Colonel Johnson read another citation, presenting John with the Silver Star for his bravery during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. On January 30th, 1968, Corporal Harkness had led his small team of Marines in battle against overwhelming enemy forces near Da Nang, continuing to fight despite being wounded and ordering his men to hold their ground. His leadership and courage had significantly contributed to the defense of Da Nang, earning him the Silver Star. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson placed the Silver Star medal on John's chest and shook his hand. "God bless you, son. Your experience will be valuable for training our men." John's mother hugged him, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said. Bob wiped away a tear and shook John's hand. "Me too." After packing his belongings into a sea bag, John changed into his Class C uniform, khaki shirt and green pants. Marines couldn't wear green uniforms off base. He met his parents, and they headed to the airport. When they arrived home, John no longer saw it as a true home since Julie's betrayal, but he appreciated the privacy. His parents stocked the fridge with beer and snacks, and his mom made his favorite dishes, including lasagna. John changed into jeans and a t-shirt, unpacking his things. At the bottom of his sea bag, he found something he'd nearly forgotten, a large Bowie knife he had discovered in Vietnam. The worn scabbard had a winged creature holding a sword, with faint words that looked like March au Crève. Though unsure of its origin, John valued it as a souvenir and planned to learn more about it. Later, he called his lawyer and George to arrange a meeting at his home. He rested and then decided to check on his prized pickup truck. It was still in the garage and appeared in good shape. After checking the fluids, he managed to start it with some effort and let it run smoothly. He planned to change the oil and give it a tune-up soon. After looking around his property, John grabbed a beer and sat in a rocking chair. His leg hurt, so he relaxed with the TV on for background noise. Not recognizing most of the shows, he settled on a game show. Then, he called Wilkins to let him know he was back. "About time," Wilkins barked. "When can you start?" John explained his situation with Julie and his physical therapy. "Take all the time you need, son. Just glad you're home. These guys could use your expertise. Stop by this week. I've got a small return gift for you." "I'll be there," John said before hanging up. Later, Mike and George arrived. John greeted them, offered beers, and they sat in the living room. "Good to see you, John," George said. "Congrats on your award. You deserve it. Now, let's get down to business." He pulled out a reel-to-reel recorder. "I've been watching Julie and Eric. One night I followed them to a steakhouse, got a seat near them, and recorded their conversation." George played the tape. Eric's voice came through first. "So, Julie, have you thought about my proposal?" "I don't know, Eric. It's bad enough I cheated on John and am pregnant with your child. I just don't think I can convince him. Come on, baby. If anyone can, it's you. He's probably desperate right now, willing to do anything to bring you home," Eric replied smugly. "You don't know John. He'll never agree to raise this child or share me with you," Julie said. "No, we won't let him touch you. Look, I'm not cut out to be a dad. John would do a better job raising the kid. If he doesn't agree, we'll threaten him with divorce, take his house, half his income, and demand alimony and child support. I already have the documents ready," Eric said. George paused the tape. "They seriously think you'd let that happen?" John asked, shocked. "There's more," George said, restarting the tape. "I don't know, Eric. John won't go for this," Julie said again. "He's so in love with you, he'll do anything," Eric said. "Unless you still have feelings for him?" "I do, but not like before. Besides, you're better in bed," Julie replied. John blushed, feeling bitter about loving such a two-faced woman. "I wouldn't have left you for Vietnam. What kind of fool does that?" Eric sneered. John felt the urge to punch something. "You're right," Julie agreed. "I'll talk to him when he gets back." "Good. Do you know when that will be?" Eric asked. "No, I haven't heard from him since January, and I haven't sent him anything since last year like you suggested," Julie said. "If he's stubborn, we have other ways to push him," Eric hinted. "Like what?" Julie asked. "Houses can burn down, brakes can fail," Eric said. "You're not planning to hurt him, are you?" Julie asked, worried. "I won't support that." "Don't worry, you won't be involved. If something happens, you get everything and you're free," Eric said. "Only as a last resort," Julie agreed. "Exactly. We'll see when he gets back," Eric replied. George turned off the tape. "That's a conspiracy to commit liquidation," John said. George and Mike agreed, adding that it could also be conspiracy to commit fraud and theft, since Julie drained John's accounts. "I filed court papers on my way here and expedited the hearing. There's also a protective order keeping them 100 feet away from you, your house, and your parents," Mike explained. "I talked to the district attorney, and they're preparing a criminal case. I also spoke with a senior partner at their firm, who's outraged. We're filing a lawsuit against the firm for violating its moral code. By the end, Swagman might end up in jail. Your father and I have friends in the department, including the chief," George added. "They'll keep an eye on you." "Any questions?" George asked. "Yes," John replied. "What should I ask for in the divorce?" Mike handed John a folder. "Your dad acted on your behalf," he said. "We're filing for divorce on grounds of infidelity and abandonment. Since she earns more than you, there's no alimony. You keep the house and everything in it because she left and didn't pay the bills. We're also demanding $7,100 from her to cover half of the joint expenses, plus the return of her rings and a name change back to her maiden name. She keeps her clothes and car. We're suing Swagman for $800,000, and the firm for $2 million for not following their moral code. The firm might settle for half to avoid bad press." Mike added, "One more thing. Do you have a dress uniform?" "Yes," John replied. "Good. Get it dry cleaned and attach your medals. I want you to wear it in court so everyone sees who Julie and Eric betrayed. I have a surprise for them, but I'll reveal it later. Just let me know when," John said. "Will do. Now I've got dinner waiting at home. Get some rest," Mike said. "I think I'll go grab a beer and see if I run into any old friends," John replied. "Be careful," George warned. "This place has gotten a bit rougher." "Not more than Da Nang," John said, and they all laughed. "Not quite," George chuckled, "but close." After George and Mike left, John went to his bedroom and changed shirts. He thought about the knife, grabbed it, and hoped to meet a friend who was knowledgeable about knives. He locked the house, walked to the garage, and started his truck. "Damn, this feels good," he thought as the truck roared to life. He pulled out and headed to one of his old spots, stopping for gas on the way. He parked in front of the bar like usual and looked around. George was right. The area had become a bit more dangerous since he was last there. "Damn," he thought, "I've seen worse." He walked into the bar through a cloud of cigarette smoke. After grabbing a beer, he looked around, searching for familiar faces, but saw no one. The place where regulars like him once hung out for a chat over beer now seemed like a gathering spot for gangsters. He finished his beer and headed back to his truck. As he passed an alley, he thought he heard a woman screaming for help. He stopped and listened. The scream echoed through the alley. "Please stop!" a woman's voice cried. He heard laughter and swearing. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he spotted the source of the sounds. A young woman was surrounded by 5 or 6 skinny men. From where he stood, He could tell they would hurt her if no one stepped in. John reached into his truck and grabbed a tool for protection. He slid it into the back of his belt and crept toward the woman, leaving his cane behind, knowing he'd need both hands. As he got closer, he saw one of the men grab the woman's dress and tear it, exposing her body as she screamed. It was time to act. "Hey!" John shouted. "Leave the woman alone. Didn't you hear her? She said stop!" The men froze and stared at John, unsure of what to make of the scarred white guy standing in their alley. One of them cautiously approached. "Or what?" he asked, pulling out a switchblade and flicking it open, assuming John would back down. John smiled and laughed. He reached back and pulled out his own knife, and the smaller man's eyes widened in fear. "You really want to do this?" he asked firmly, trying to defuse the situation. The man twisted his knife and tried to move around John, positioning himself between John and his buddies. John saw through the maneuver and countered, preventing the man from carrying out his plan. The gangster charged with his knife. John dodged, grabbed the man's wrist, and with a swift move, the knife fell from his hand as he cried out in pain. John quickly reacted, dodging the incoming attack, and with a swift movement, managed to disarm the man, sending him stumbling to the ground. The rest of the group, confused and shaken, began to back away. They'd never seen a knife that size, and they definitely hadn't seen anyone take down their friend like that, especially not a white guy. Most of them scattered, but two stayed behind to face John. Unfortunately, John didn't see or hear the man coming up from behind with a large wooden board, a nail sticking out of it. "Look out behind you!" the woman screamed. John turned just in time to see the board swing toward him, and everything went black as it punched the side of his head. He collapsed, bracing for another shot, but the man dropped the weapon and fled as red and blue lights flashed at the alley's entrance. John sat up slowly as a cop approached him. "Damn it, Harkness," the cop said. "Didn't George warn you this was a rough area?" "Yeah," John muttered, holding his head. "I guess I'm too stubborn to listen." The cop surveyed the scene and told his partner to call for a couple of ambulances. He grabbed 2 more pairs of handcuffs, went over to the men lying on the ground and cuffed them. Returning to John, he spotted the large knife beside him. "Now that's a knife," the officer said, picking it up. "Where'd you get this?" "I picked it up in Vietnam," John replied. "Hand it over," the officer said. "Got a case for it?" John pulled out the leather sheath and handed it to him. The officer examined it closely. "Foreign Legion. Seriously?" he asked. "Marines," John said. "Just got back." "I know you were in the Marines, John. I'm talking about the markings on the sheath. That symbol means French Foreign Legion, and the words under it mean march or die. This isn't standard issue. I bet it belonged to a French soldier once." He handed the knife back to John. "Better store this somewhere safe before a tough cop confiscates it. Maybe hang it up in a frame." John nodded. "Yeah, I'll do that." The woman, visibly shaken, approached the officer. "Please don't arrest him, officer," she said. "He saved my life. Those men were going to hurt me." The officer looked at her torn dress. "It's all right, ma'am. He's not under arrest, but he'll need to see a doctor, and we'll need your statement. I'll take him to the ER in my car and give my statement there. Is that okay?" she asked. The cop thought for a moment and then agreed. "All right, miss. You can follow me to the hospital," he said, calling over to his partner, who approached quickly. Another officer glanced at the handcuffed men on the ground and whistled. "Damn," he said. "Isn't this Juan Mendoza, the gang leader we've been hearing about?" The first cop nodded. "Yeah, that's him." "And this guy took out all 3 of them?" the second cop asked. The first cop nodded again. "Seems like it," he replied. "Damn," the second cop muttered. By then, 2 ambulances had arrived, and the paramedics were loading the gang members onto stretchers. The first cop helped John to his feet. "You didn't get enough of this stuff in Vietnam?" he asked with a grin. John laughed, though it hurt. "Apparently not," he said. "All I wanted was to have a beer with my friends." "Well, this young lady will take you to the ER. Hand over your keys. My partner will drive your truck home, and I'll pick him up after we're done at the hospital," the cop said, pointing at John. "And stay away from this place. It's not what it used to be. The regulars hang out at Rockwood on the other side of town now." "Thanks, officer. I'll keep that in mind," John said. He followed the young woman, who introduced herself as Amelia Simmons, to her small Dodge Dart. "Aren't you the guy who earned the Silver Star in Vietnam?" she asked on the way to the hospital. "Yeah," he replied. "How do you know about that?" "Who doesn't? It was all over the news today," she said. "But what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be home with your wife or something?" John couldn't hold back and started crying quietly. He didn't know what hurt more, Julie's betrayal or the fact that strangers seemed to care more about him than his own wife. "Sorry," Amelia said. "I didn't mean to upset you. What happened?" John gave her the short version of his marriage ending, and she began to cry too. She pulled into the ER parking lot, found a space, and hugged him. "That's awful," she said. "That woman doesn't deserve you." Tears streamed down her face. John looked at her and asked, "Why are you crying?" "Those men were going to hurt or even eliminate me. But you stepped in when you could have died. You don't even know me, yet you were willing to risk your life for me," she cried. "I can never repay you for that." John hugged her back. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "No, I do. I owe you everything. You saved my life even when you were already hurting. So I'll do the same for you. No matter how long it takes, I'll help heal your broken heart," she said. "I promise, no one will hurt you again. Not like she did." "You don't even know me," John said. "And you didn't know me either," she replied. "But after tonight, I know all I need to. John Harkness, you're my hero, my knight in shining armor. I want to take care of you, hold you, and fill the emptiness in your heart. Please let me." John considered her words. He looked into her eyes and saw only love, no deceit. There was a beauty in her he couldn't quite describe, perhaps because of all the pain from Julie. In the back of his mind, he heard Harker's voice. "Come on, Corporal." "Sorry, Sergeant." John smiled, though Amelia didn't know why. "Okay," he said, kissing her gently. She hugged him tightly. "You won't regret this, John, I promise," she said. They entered the emergency room where the officer was waiting while the doctor examined John and Amelia. The doctor cleaned John's cheek wound and took x-rays. After reviewing the images, he looked at John. "You must have a jaw made of steel," the doctor said. Amelia was fine as well. John gave his statement about the evening's events, and the officer seemed satisfied. "John," the cop said, "Amelia's a good girl, but she's had it rough. Her parents died in a car crash a few years back, and she's been on her own since. Her last boyfriend was abusive. She finally left him, but now she's homeless and has been living in her car for 3 days. I know you've got your own problems, but maybe you could help her out. Heck, maybe you both can help each other." "Thanks," John said. "Maybe you're right." John was taken aback by what the officer said. Amelia hadn't mentioned any of her struggles, yet she had been there comforting him. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Love, maybe. Whatever it was definitely better than anything Julie had given him. The officer handed him a card. "Call me if you need anything," he said before walking over to Amelia. "Follow me to John's house. I need to pick up my partner anyway," he said. She thanked him, and they left the ER. They drove to John's house in silence. John had a lot on his mind. His soon-to-be ex-wife had treated him like dirt. His fellow Marines were gone. And now there was Amelia. John didn't believe in coincidences, but he couldn't help but wonder. Both of them were in pain, but each had set their pain aside to help and comfort the other. They finally arrived at John's house, and after the officers left, he invited her inside. "It's okay, Amelia, I don't bite. It's way more comfortable here than in your car," he said. "I don't want to impose," she replied. John grabbed one of her bags from the car. "Nonsense," he said. "It's no imposition. I've got a spare room, and it's a lot safer than sleeping in your car at a rest stop." "Okay," she said. "You're probably right." Once Amelia's things were set up in the guest room, John invited her into the living room and offered her a cup of coffee. She accepted and settled on the couch. While making coffee for both of them, they swapped stories. John told Amelia about his marriage and time in Vietnam, and Amelia shared her life story. John learned that her parents were hardworking but had struggled financially. They died in a car accident while they were living in an apartment, leaving Amelia with nothing. She sold what little she had but ended up on the streets. The small savings her parents left behind went toward their final expenses. After losing her job as a secretary when her boss moved, she found work as a waitress at a diner near the alley where she was attacked. She earned just enough to share an apartment with a friend, but when her friend moved to another state, Amelia couldn't afford the rent alone. She dated a man briefly, but he became violent when she refused his advances. So she left and returned to sleeping in her car, hoping to save enough to rent a room. "Why don't you stay here?" John asked. "I can't take advantage of your kindness like that," she said. "I can't pay you anything, and it won't look good with your divorce going on." "It's no problem," John said. "You can stay in the spare room and maybe help me keep the place in order. As for the divorce, if anyone asks, I'll just say you were homeless, and I let you stay in exchange for help around the house." "That sounds fair," Amelia said. "I hope you don't get tired of me." John laughed. I doubt it, he said. I hope you can stand looking at this ugly face, he added, pointing to his scar. She gently ran her fingers over his scar and ear. I can handle it, she said. Actually, I think it makes you look tough, like someone who doesn't take crap from anyone, John chuckled. Flattery will get you far. By the way, things might get a little hectic here for the next couple of days, he said. Julie and her lover are getting their papers tomorrow morning, so I expect the phone will start ringing around 9 a.m. I also have some errands. Want to join me? Of course, she said. I've got a few days off. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted, and my leg is starting to hurt. I'm heading to bed, John said. I'll come with you if that's all right, she said, following him down the hallway. Do you mind if I sleep with you tonight? No, Zex, I just need someone to hold me. Of course, he replied. I promise to behave. She smiled and went to the bathroom to shower and change, while John got ready for bed. He was already under the covers when she returned, wearing a long t-shirt and underwear. She slid under the blanket and he instinctively wrapped his arms around her. She placed her hand on his chest and rested her head on his shoulder. She feels so good, John thought. They fell asleep and woke up the next morning with John still holding Amelia, his hand on her bare bosom. He quickly pulled away, startling her. Sorry, he said. Amelia smiled. They showered and got ready for the day. While Amelia prepared breakfast, John got dressed. At 9:20 a.m., the phone rang. What the hell is this, John? Julie yelled. I don't want a divorce. And what's all this about cheating and abandonment? I don't care what you want now. Julie, John replied. You moved out, refused to pay the bills, stole thousands, slept with Eric Swagman, moved in with him, and now you're pregnant with his baby or someone else's. That clear things up? I didn't know you were back, John, or I would have come to you, she said. Nonsense, Julie. It was all over the news. People I don't even know welcome me home. But not you. You were too busy cheating with your boyfriend to care about your husband, he said. You don't understand, John. I still love you, she cried. No, you don't, Julie. I haven't heard from you since last year. I found out everything from my parents when they visited me in the hospital after I got shot. You didn't even send me a card. How can you claim you love me when you're carrying someone else's child? But I love you, John, she insisted. No, you don't, Julie, he said sharply. What did you tell him when you talked about me raising your fool? How do you know what I said? She asked, crying. He had never spoken to her like this before. Do you really mean it? Just sign the damn papers and get it over with. We're done. And I'll take your boyfriend down with you. Suddenly, Eric picked up the phone. Listen, a-hole, I'll bury you, he threatened. I don't think so, idiot. Tougher men than you have tried and ended up 6 feet under. You want to go up against me? I'll bury you, and you'll be begging for mercy. I heard you planning to torch my house and mess with my truck. Try it, and I promise you, you'll regret it. You'll be lucky not to end up in prison, John replied. We'll see, Eric shot back. Julie got back on the phone. John, please, let's talk this through. There's no need for a divorce. Eric and I have a proposal for you, she said. If you want to talk to my lawyer, John responded. Here's my proposal. Go to hell and die. He hung up and punched the wall. Damn her, he yelled. Amelia came up and hugged him. It's okay, John. She had it coming. They both did. Let your lawyer handle this. That's why you pay him. Calm down, please, she said. How can she say she loves me after everything she's done? John asked. I don't know, John, Amelia replied. It's obvious she's not in her right mind. Come on, didn't you say we had things to do today? Let's get going. You're right, he said. What's first on the list? She asked. I need to visit my civilian boss, get my dress uniform dry cleaned, and have the medals pinned on it. Then, buy parts for the truck and do some maintenance, he replied. Let's get to it, she said. We've got a busy day. But first, I'll call my lawyer, John added. Amelia agreed, and John made the call, telling Mike about Julie's earlier call. Yeah, I figured she'd lose it, Mike said. And Swagman looked ready to break something. I'll be curious to see what they come up with. By the way, I talked to Lee. He's meeting with the senior partners and board this afternoon. Also, make sure your dress uniform is ready. Trial's next Friday. Got it. Thanks, Mike, John said. I'm taking care of it today. I'll call if anything else comes up. They left the house and dropped off John's uniform and medals at the cleaners, giving detailed instructions on how to handle them. The owner, an old military vet, knew exactly how to do it right. Then they headed to old Wilkins's shop. Hey, boss, John said as he and Amelia walked in. Wilkins glanced up from a stack of papers. Well, look who it is, Wilkins said. Damn, I need a secretary. I don't have time for all this paperwork. I've got cars to fix. John glanced at Amelia. Seriously, you need a secretary? Hell yeah, Wilkins said. I've got paperwork, phones to answer, and customers to deal with. I know someone who was a secretary and might be looking for a better job. Interested? John asked. Hell yes, Wilkins said. John took Amelia's hand. Boss, meet my friend, Amelia Simmons. She was a secretary, John said. Wilkins looked her over. Think you can handle all this, young lady? He asked. Amelia nodded. Absolutely. I can type 50 words a minute, sort documents, take shorthand, work with customers, and even run the cash register. Wilkins considered her for a moment. Are you working now? He asked. Yes, but I'm a waitress and not making much, she said. Here's what I'll do. Give your boss 2 weeks' notice, then come work for me. I'll start you at $125 a week since you're John's friend. How's that sound? Wilkins offered. That sounds great. Thank you, Mr. Wilkins, she said, smiling. You know anything about cars? He asked. Not as much as you, but my dad taught me a lot, she replied. Even better, Wilkins said. Oh, John, I've got something for you, Wilkins said, pulling out an envelope from his desk and handing it to John. Consider it a welcome home bonus. John opened the envelope to find a check for $2,340. He shook Wilkins' hand. Thanks, boss. This means a lot. You've earned it. Deal with your cheating wife, then get back to work, Wilkins said, grinning. It's on my list, boss, John replied with a smile. Wilkins waved them off. You guys go. As they left the shop, Amelia looked at John in amazement. Wow, $125 a week? I've never made that much. Thanks again, John. You're welcome, John replied. Did you know that's almost double what I make as a sergeant in the Corps? Really? Amelia asked, surprised. Oh yeah, John said. So you really know about cars? Yes, my dad taught me how to tune cars, change belts and tires, and do oil changes. We didn't have much, so he fixed everything himself, she said. Don't tell Wilkins that. He'll have you under every car in the shop, John joked. Amelia laughed. I wouldn't mind getting some grease under my nails. You take care of the truck and I'll show you what I can do, she said, giving him a wink. John grinned. Damn, girl, I think I'm in love. Amelia giggled and kissed him on the cheek. Me too, she whispered. They stopped at John's bank, where he deposited the check and set aside 10% for savings as usual. He kept $100 in cash and ordered new checks, without Julie's name on them. Then, they went to the auto parts store to pick up everything John needed for the truck. After grabbing burgers, they headed home. Home, John thought. With Amelia by his side, it really felt like home. He parked the truck in the garage and started prepping for work while Amelia changed clothes. When she returned, she wore old jeans and a t-shirt. So, what's the plan? John asked. Amelia grabbed the spark plugs and wires. I'll do the spark plugs and wires while you handle the oil, she said confidently. Okay, John said, surprised. You know how to check the spark plug gaps? You're kidding, right? She replied, gathering the tools and getting to work. John was amazed at how smoothly she handled the tools. He worked on the oil change while she replaced the plugs, wires, rotor, and distributor cap. When he finished, he inspected her work, genuinely impressed. Everything looked perfect. Still, John knew looks could be deceiving, so he lowered the truck, climbed in, and started the engine. It hummed smoothly, just as he'd hoped. He revved the engine, listening for any issues, but there were none. Satisfied, he turned off the engine and looked at Amelia, now with oil smudges on her hands and face. In that moment, she looked more beautiful to him than Julie ever had. Well? She asked, a bit unsure. John took her face in his dirty hands and kissed her on the lips. Now I know for sure I'm in love, he said. You're hired. Amelia smiled, not caring that her face was even dirtier now. John handed her some hand cleaner. There had been a time when he wished Julie would share moments like this, but she always found his work too dirty. After cleaning up, Amelia cooked dinner, and they spent a quiet evening watching TV. For the first time in a long while, John felt content and didn't think about his soon-to-be ex-wife. The next few days passed quickly. John picked up his uniform from the dry cleaners and spent hours removing loose threads, polishing his boots, and shining his cap visor. Amelia handed in her resignation at the diner, only to be told she was fired on the spot. She left, knowing she'd have to return for her final paycheck in a few days. As the days went by, John and Amelia grew closer. They both agreed to wait until John's divorce was finalized before deepening their relationship. John found this difficult. It had been a long time since he'd been with a woman, but he was falling in love with Amelia and knew she felt the same. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. After breakfast, John showered, shaved, and dressed, then walked into the living room where Amelia was waiting in a beautiful dress. "Wow," she said, admiring him in his full dress uniform with his medals. "You look like you're ready to be devoured." John smiled. "Thanks, but I feel like a Christmas tree." "You look amazing too," he added. At the courthouse, they were greeted by 14 uniformed Marines from John's unit, including Lieutenant Colonel Johnson and Sergeant Major Roberts. After introductions, they went inside, where the Marines filled 2 rows of the courtroom. John joined his lawyer, Mike, at the table while his parents sat with the Marines. John glanced over at Julie and Eric at the other table. Julie's eyes widened at the sight of the man she had betrayed, while Eric smirked, resting his hand on Julie's pregnant belly. Julie hadn't noticed Amelia yet. The judge entered, and the bailiff instructed everyone to stand. Once seated, the judge noticed the Marines and asked, "What brings you here today, gentlemen?" Lieutenant Colonel Johnson stood. "Your Honor, we're here to support Sergeant Harkness and, if necessary, testify to his character." The judge nodded with a smile. "Thank you, Colonel. I don't think it'll be needed, but I appreciate the gesture." The Marines remained silent, glaring at Julie and Eric throughout the proceedings. As Mike predicted, the case went smoothly. The judge questioned both John and Julie about their marriage and the circumstances leading to the divorce. Julie admitted to leaving John, not paying bills, and becoming pregnant by Eric Swagman, who absurdly demanded child support from John. "Do you seriously expect me to order Mr. Harkness to pay child support for a child you fathered?" the judge asked incredulously. "Are you serious or just stupid?" Denied. Every request Swagman made was denied. In the end, the judge ruled in John's favor, granting him the house, issuing a permanent restraining order, denying child support, and ordering Julie to return half of the money she withdrew from their joint account. She was also instructed to revert to her maiden name. There was no need to return the wedding rings, as Julie had already discarded them. Swagman tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "And as for you, Mr. Swagman," the judge added, pointing with his gavel, "I'm ordering an investigation into your role in all this. At a minimum, there's a serious conflict of interest here, and the district attorney is considering other charges, including conspiracy." Swagman's face reddened as the judge continued. "Your actions today will weigh heavily on any future proceedings. Mr. Harkness's divorce is granted." Swagman jumped up in a rage. "You fool! I'll have your ex and any other woman you're with, and I'll bury you." John stayed calm. "I don't think so," he replied quietly. Swagman looked around, his anger meeting the stern gazes of the Marines and John's steady indifference. Julie avoided his eyes, her head hung in shame. Before Swagman could say another word, the bailiff stepped in, placing a firm hand on his shoulder and guiding him back to his seat. John shook his head, as Swagman sat defeated. Lee Marcus, who had been watching from the back of the courtroom, approached. "You're fired," he told Swagman bluntly. "I'm also filing a formal complaint with the bar. Pack your things and leave by the end of the day." Swagman clenched his fists, but said nothing as Lee turned to Julie. "Julie, you're still employed, at least until you have the baby and recover. After that, we'll reevaluate your position." Julie nodded silently as Lee turned to John. "Sergeant, thank you for your service," Lee said, shaking John's hand. "On behalf of the firm and our board, I apologize for everything you've gone through." John nodded, his gaze still fixed on Julie. Lee then addressed Mike. "Given the situation and John's service, the board finds your original proposal acceptable. No need to prolong this or waste any more money. Let's finalize the details next week." Mike nodded. "Thanks, Lee. I'll call you Monday." As Lee left, John turned to Amelia, who had quietly observed everything. She embraced him tightly, and he took comfort in her presence. When they parted, John noticed Julie watching, tears in her eyes. "John, I'm so sorry," Julie said, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." John's response was cold. "Well, you did." Julie wiped her eyes. "Why did it have to come to this?" "You weren't there, Julie. Eric was. You saw dollar signs and made your choices. Now you live with them," John said. Julie's voice was barely audible. "What's this about you raising my baby?" John's eyes narrowed. "Eric thought I'd raise your child while you stayed with him. It's ridiculous." "I didn't like the idea, but I considered it," Julie admitted. "I'm sorry." John just shook his head. Julie glanced at Amelia, realizing who she was. "I see you've moved on," she said bitterly. Amelia stepped forward. "I'm not just replacing you. I'm here to heal the heart you broke, and I intend to do that for the rest of my life." Julie looked down. I guess I deserve that. John, his tone softer but still hurt, asked, "Can we ever be friends, Julie?" "I don't know. I don't deserve your forgiveness," she replied, eyes filled with regret. John sighed. "It'll take time. If it weren't for Amelia and my parents, I don't think I'd be here." Tears streamed down Julie's face as she left. John felt both sadness and relief as he watched her go. Turning to Mike, he shook his hand. "Thanks for everything, Mike. I owe you." Mike waved it off. "That's what friends are for. Besides, knocking Swagman down a peg was satisfying. Now go celebrate. You've earned it." After shaking hands with the Marines, John and Amelia left the courthouse. His parents were waiting, and his mother hugged him. "We're so proud of you, son," she said, then turned to Amelia. "Who's this lovely young lady?" John introduced Amelia, and his parents warmly welcomed her, inviting her to dinner. "We want to know the woman who makes our son so happy," his mother said. "I'd love that," Amelia replied. The following weeks were a turning point for John. His divorce finalized, he was free to move forward. He and Amelia grew closer, and one evening, after receiving the final decree, John proposed. Amelia said yes, and they were married soon after in a Marine sword ceremony. They continued working at Wilkins' shop, though they didn't need the money. When Wilkins passed away in 1980, he left the shop to John. John remained in the Marine Reserves, retiring as a staff sergeant in 1992, a year after returning from Operation Desert Storm. Though he still dreamed of his Vietnam comrades, John learned to cope, just like his father had. He and Amelia ran the shop until their retirement in 2008, passing it to their two sons. Life was peaceful until one evening, years later, when John spotted a tattoo design in a parlor window. It was a rose, similar to one he had seen in Vietnam, with space for a name. On a whim, John let Amelia into the shop. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I almost got this tattoo with Julie's name back in Vietnam. Now I want yours above my heart where it belongs," John said. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "But why?" "Because you healed my heart, and I want the world to know how much I love you," John replied. The tattoo artist looked at John skeptically. "You sure, old man?" John chuckled, taking off his shirt. "Absolutely." Amelia, still holding his hand, asked, "Won't it hurt?" "Yeah, like hell," John grinned. "But it'll be worth it." As the needle buzzed to life, John smiled, knowing the pain was nothing compared to the love he'd found.